So my name is Gail Elmore. I am a graduate of USC. I got my PhD in school psychology there. I am currently the lead psychologist in Lexington Richland 5 School District. I've been practicing psychology I've been here for about 15 years, but only lead for the last 3. I've worked with students anywhere from kindergarten through 12th grade. I also typically teach about 1 class a year at USC. I do, more recently, I've been teaching graduate courses in cognitive psychology and in personality assessment, but I've also taught undergraduate courses in psychology. My favorite is personality, and I also love teaching adolescence, psychology of adolescence. So those are just some things about me. Okay, so I want to talk just a little bit about why it is important for professors in college to know about students with disability. More and more kids are coming to college who have disabilities. Now, I'm going to speak specifically about specific learning disabilities today because that is the largest group. But more and more students are coming to college with disabilities. And because they are still a minority, that kind of conveys minority status to them. They're not well understood. It's an invisible disability, which I will also talk about in a minute for most students. And so what we want to do is to make sure that it's a welcoming environment for them. And the ADA, the law, Americans with Disability Act, does provide accommodations for students with disabilities. And so it's very important that we make sure that students know that they have those things available. Now, I'll tell you working with K through 12, any student with an IEP, what we do is we work really hard on advocacy and starting in high school, actually before high school, we start working on a transition plan for students. What do they want to do? And then helping them to achieve whatever their goal is. So we work with students who have IEPs. Students who might have a 504 plan, which is what students have in college, may not have that same advocacy training. So not every student arrives at college ready to advocate for themselves. Why you matter. So research shows that the attitude of the professor and their perception of what you think about accommodations for kids with disabilities, and I say kids because I'm used to saying kids, by the time a lot of them are adults at this point, is more significant than that of their peers. We think of adolescents, because a lot of these people are still adolescents, we think of adolescents as being much more sensitive to what their peers think, and a lot of them are, but your perceptions, what you convey to them is more important to them in their willingness to speak up than it is what their peers think. So your attitude, your ability to communicate, openness to accommodating students with disabilities is critical for students with disabilities. As I said a minute ago, specific learning disability is by far the largest area of kids who receive special education. You can see it, 33%, this was done in 2020 or 2020, 33% of students who receive services for special education have a specific learning disability. And that's where I'm really gonna probably get down in the weeds a little bit with you guys and talk about some of the characteristics and some of the accommodations. Speech language impairment is second, and a lot of kids with speech language impairment, there's an overlap with specific learning disability and speech language impairment. A lot of kids with early speech delays are later identified as having disabilities in reading. There's a lot of overlap. So some challenges for kids with disabilities. It's invisible. A lot of times, you know, you don't know. You don't know that a student has a disability. If a student has a visible disability, we respond to it more, we respond to it differently than if they do, than if it's invisible. Just the word disability. It's hard to think about, we think about disability and we say, okay, yeah. So you have a physical disability or a hearing or vision impairment, but we don't think about a learning disability as being so much of a disability because somehow they've managed to get to college. But it is a disability, and a lot of kids also have an issue with the word disability. They don't think of themselves as having a disability. That's something we work on as well in college, in high school, is working on, to help them understand what their disability is and the things they can do to accommodate it, because we know that by the time they get to college, the accommodations are what they're going to have. So we also know that not every high school is equal. Not all schools provide the same level of service to kids, and so they may or may not have had really good training in self-advocacy. Kids may or may not be aware of what resources are available to them in college. USC has a great disability center, and I've had plenty of students who were aware of it and who had contacted them, had their letter. I had knowledge that the student had a disability, but I've had other students that didn't know about the resources that were available. I go back to that advocacy training, whether or not they've had it. A lot of times kids who have had 504s have not had that advocacy training, and they aren't ready for the fact that there's not an annual meeting held and their teacher doesn't get the accommodations unless they go and tell someone. And then family perception. Not every family is open to the idea that their child has a disability. Not every family encourages that child or encourages that student to self-identify. The other thing is that not every family knows how to do that. So one of the things that we work really hard in K through 12 is to talk about what happens after high school. What happens, what's next? What are your plans and what are we going to do to get you there? All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about IDEA. Sounds like a lot of folks are familiar with it. All right, give me can you give a specific example? Be more specific about what type, let me go back. ADHD, no. So a specific learning disability is not ADHD. And I'm going to talk right now about what this is. So there is a disability, yes, ADHD is absolutely a disability under IDEA. It falls under a category called other health impairment, which is a huge umbrella that encompasses things like diabetes, schizophrenia, all sorts of things fall under other health impairments. Schizophrenia can also fall under another umbrella as well. But what I'm going to be talking about today is just learning disabilities. Now there is overlap. A lot of kids who have learning disabilities also have attention issues. So there is some overlap, particularly in written expression. But what I'm going to talk about today is specific learning disabilities. So under IDEA, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, there are 13 areas that qualify a student for special education. Specific learning disability is one of those 13. Within SLD, there are these 7 areas of impairment. There's 3 areas in reading, 2 in math, then there's written expression, oral expression, and listening comprehension. We do specific testing in K through 12 and have to follow IDEA regulations to determine whether a child qualifies for special education services as a student with a specific learning disability. Now let me clarify one thing about specific learning disability. The word specific is critical here because Individuals with Disability Education Act, the most recent renewal was in 2004. It takes them forever to renew it. But they do it every so often. And in 2004, they actually added reading fluency. Reading fluency was not a disability prior to that. So students are evaluated by a school psychologist, and then they have to meet a second prong. There's a couple of questions that you have to answer in order to qualify. That second prong is that disability needs to have an impact on academic functioning when compared to their peers. And there needs to be specialized instruction. So a child might have a disability based on our testing, but their grades are great, they're not struggling, they're fine, and they're accommodating quite well. They're accommodating themselves quite well, and so they don't need specialized instruction. We might then provide what's called a 504 plan, which is what they have in college, and just provide accommodations, and we can talk more about that. Ultimately, with IDEA, that determination of eligibility is made by a team. So you have a special education teacher, you have a school psychologist, you have a general education teacher, you have the parent. Quite often when the kids are older, you even have the student in the room. When we get to high school, we want the student in the room. So a team decides that this child has a disability, and the team decides that this child needs specialized instruction to accommodate that disability. Now let me tell you, it's a little different in private practice. So in private practice, typically folks use what's called the DSM-5. Don't ask me to do that one. It's Diagnostic, Statistical Manual. I'm not going to be able to do that one right off the top of my head. I'm sorry. But it identifies similar areas. So it says word reading accuracy, reading rate or fluency, and reading comprehension. They mention dyslexia, and I'm going to talk about dyslexia in a minute. They mention specifically spelling accuracy, grammar and punctuation, clarity and organization of written expression. Dysgraphia, weirdly, is not mentioned. They mention dyslexia. Dysgraphia is a written disability, but they don't mention it in the new DSM-5, and I'm not sure why. They also don't mention dyscalculia, which is a math disability. And but we do see often in general education, we do see kids who have those diagnoses, and that's different because those are made by an individual in private practice or maybe in a clinic or even in a hospital. Those are made in a different way than we do in schools. Again, the severity is mild, moderate, or severe. The key here is that if a child has an outside diagnosis that's been made by a private practitioner, we in education, we consider that, we look at that, we determine if we need more information. We can still look at that to consider eligibility for special education and for a 504. But it's just a difference. I wanted you to understand a little bit about the difference in the way that disabilities can be identified. So when you have a student who comes to you, know that the road to get there, who's got an accommodation in a 504, the road as to how they got there might be a little bit different. They may have had lots of support in high school, in trainings in advocacy, and they may have had a lot of support in remediating those academic weaknesses, or they may have just had accommodations, and that's all. So not every student comes prepared to college in the same manner. How comfortable are you in discussing a student's disability with them? This can be a very, for some folks, this can be quite awkward. Somewhat uncomfortable, neutral. Okay. If they are open in discussing it. That's a very good point. Very good point, Shauna. It can be challenging to know whether or not the student, you have to kind of take a reading on what the student is saying. I definitely wouldn't bring it up first, but a student, they're more than willing. I totally understand that. It can be a very awkward conversation. For me, I'm often, my discussions with students are typically they've just been evaluated, and I'm telling them information about themselves and how they learn and what they're good at and what they're not. So I have kind of this whole picture. But for you guys, it's like you're there teaching them something, and then if they aren't talking about it, it can be a challenge, especially if it doesn't seem like they want to talk about it. And we don't want to intrude. But it does seem like most of you are somewhat comfortable talking, so that's wonderful. Remembering what I said before about it's really important to be open to that students perceive you as being open to accommodations and to the discussion. That's really important, because how students, especially freshmen, are taking the lead from you, and you're setting the norms for them. So it's especially those of you who teach University of 101. I like this. Let's see. I use Google Poll privately before class begins, asking them. That is awesome. I love that, Lee. That's wonderful. I can honestly say I've never done that, but I love that idea and I may steal it. That's a great idea. I usually stand at the front of the room and talk, but I haven't used Google actually teaching lately, except until this year. That is a great idea, Lee. Thank you. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about some broad characteristics of very specific disabilities. It seems kind of like an oxymoron, but I'm going to get in the weeds now. So I want to talk a little bit about basic reading. If you remember, we talked about the IDEA specific learning categories. So basic reading difficulties, kids can have trouble with letter sound knowledge. So a child or a student with basic reading difficulties can manifest very differently. It could be very simply letter sound knowledge. I've worked with kids who just the sound of for cat, for that C is a challenge for them. Basic vocabulary knowledge. A lot of students don't have a strong vocabulary. They don't come to school with one, and then that puts them behind, and then they get further behind. Difficulty sounding out words. So kids can have just the whole cat for cat. That can be a torture for some kids. Difficulty recognizing words. Some kids just can't look at the word and understand the gestalt of that word, that the word cat is cat. They have to sound it out. And all of these things can impact fluency because it's how fast they can read, as well as comprehension, because if they are struggling with each word in a sentence, they don't remember what the first few words were. They can't comprehend. So basic reading is probably, it is the foundation, and it affects all of the other reading areas. So if a student has a disability in basic reading, it has kind of a cascading effect. For reading fluency, again, I go back to that where I used the example of cat, where they're sounding it out. They're relying too heavily on the phonological structure of a word. Also, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about cognitive skills. Fluency suffers when a student has a slower processing speed. How good are the diagnostic tests in distinguishing between second languages? So let me answer that question. Does that prior slide include stuttering, or is that stuttering is under a speech language impairment? But yes, sometimes kids who have a history of stuttering do also have difficulty with the phonological awareness. That sometimes what it is it leads to that problems where here I talk about they haven't learned words to automaticity. But stuttering is a little different in that it is oral language, but we see it as well when kids read. Now I want to go back up to the diagnostic test. So let me tell you, I don't want to get too far in the weeds with that. So what we do is we have a specific program that actually is based on, I'm trying to remember who the professor or who the researcher was, where we take each individual subtest that we give a student and we load it into a program to determine the cultural and language loading of that subtest. So if a student does poorly on all the subtests that are cultural, that have a high cultural load and a high language load, we know that they haven't mastered the language. We also take a look at what are their scores on the language test that most kids who have English as a second language, most of those kids are learning. So we take a look at those tests. There's a thing called BICS and CALPS, which you may or may not heard of. So those kinds of things. So there's a basic intercommunication skills where kids can sound like they know. Kids with English is their second language have really good social interaction, really good social skills, but they haven't learned the language to learn. So a student, a lot of times we get referrals from teachers who say, well, this kid's great. He's great in class, but he doesn't really have the learning language yet. And so we look at those kids, we say, no, this is not a specific learning disability. This is we haven't mastered English yet. Because we do not want to identify a child as having a learning disability when in reality the issue is they haven't mastered English. All right. Do you recommend having a specific survey asking about students' disability? Ooh, that's an interesting. You could make open, you could make it open-ended. What would you like to share with me about your disability? If you have a disability, what is important for me to know? You could certainly do that. And here's Lee again. Do you ask them that specific? Like, what are they interested in? What media they enjoy? Who their favorite authors are, favorite class so far, and what she can do to support. I think that's wonderful. Is there anything else you guys are awesome. This is great. And see, I'm going to be doing this too. I love this idea. So when I talk about processing speed, I talk about one of the cognitive skills. It's essentially how fast you process information. We know that reading disabilities can be related to both processing speed and working memory. Yeah, I like that, Lee. So it's part of it. It's a very general questionnaire, but you have specific questions that give you great information. And then fluency suffers when a student hasn't learned words to automaticity. They don't see cat and recognize cat. All right, so on to this next one where I talked about fluency, and it's just how quickly you can read. Reading comprehension. So they may have good mechanics of reading, but struggle to comprehend what they're reading. Often working memory is a weakness. So working memory is just how much information you can hold in your head. Think of when you have to remember a phone number. They have difficulty organizing what they've read. So they can't, and we see this in kids with ADHD as well, that they can't really organize their thoughts. So if you read a story to them and ask them to give you the story back, they'll get pieces of it, but they may miss the most important pieces. Comprehension, again, suffers with slow fluency, kind of that cascade effect I talked about, and also suffers with weak vocabulary and word recognition skills, which goes all the way back to basic reading. So a lot of times if you have a student with poor basic reading skills, it's just, it cascades. They don't read fluently and they don't comprehend what they read. Let me talk for a second about dyslexia. So dyslexia is a very specific type of reading disability. We have specific assessments that we do to look at it. It's very much in line with that basic reading disability. It can range from mild to severe. It's important that I think that you guys know, if any of you have children, that recent legislation in South Carolina mandates that screening for legislation occur in kindergarten and first grade. And if a student is identified as at risk, they are provided with reading interventions. Now, a lot of districts take those interventions all the way up through 5th grade and some even up to 12th grade, depending, and it's not just for dyslexia. But this was a huge bill that I think is going to go a long way towards helping us to catch kids early, and hoping, in my mind, I'm hoping that it will reduce the number of students who require special education. All students who are identified as having a specific learning disability do not have dyslexia. That's important. But again, all students who have been identified as having dyslexia may not have a specific learning disability because it could be mild. We have a lot of students who cope really well. You may end up, though, with a student in your class who has dyslexia and has a 504, and they receive accommodations for that. All right, so some of the accommodations that you might come across and think about with students. Students with reading disabilities often use text-to-speech software. So if there is a way for them to either use a pen, which will they can slide across the front, they can slide across the test question, or whatever they're trying to read. If there's a way to do that, the pen will actually read the words to them. So technology has come a long way in helping kids with reading disabilities. So audiobooks, if there are audiobooks available for the books that you assign, let's say you assign some literature. If there's audiobooks, it would be so much easier for the student, actually necessary for the student to be able to use those. They may need extended time for tests, or they may need the test read to them. Any copies that you have of your presentation, if they can get digital copies where they can actually go and have it read to them by using, Google has the little puzzle piece. I can't remember what it's called, but it's speech to text and text to speech. But Google has that, and it's a wonderful tool that a lot of students use. Blackboard has the ability to produce different formats of documents that are uploaded to Blackboard. Thank you. And I want to know about online tests as well. If Blackboard will read an online test, I'm not sure. Because I've always given paper and pencil tests and asked students to write on, after years of having problems with kids using Scantrons, I kind of gave up. And if it's an undergrad, and I just gave them a test and say, write on it, it's fine. I'll deal with it. And then I'll transfer it to the Scantron myself. A screen reader can work with Blackboard, but it's not built in. And if you're using Google Chrome at the moment, I don't know if you have the little puzzle piece off the top of the right, but I have the little puzzle piece, and it will read. And even just on your phone, if a student can read it on their phone, the phone will read to you as well. All right, so this is what I want you to think about. You have a student who participates and appears prepared for all classes. On the first test, you anticipate that she will do well, and instead she does poorly, and you notice many misspellings in her answer, and it doesn't appear that she finished the exam. What would you do? The phones. All right, so what a student can do with their phone, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but you can push, there's a way that you can have your phone read things to you. So if you're looking, like say I'm reading a newspaper article online on my phone, you can highlight it and it will read to you. Side note, I recently found out that PowerPoint's latest version provides a transcript at the bottom of each slide. This is true. There's also closed captioning. All Microsoft products will transcribe ongoing now. This is wonderful, you guys. I appreciate you sharing this with me. So much of what I do is, or have done, is lecture. This teaching and having to do virtually has taught everybody so many new things. This is wonderful, y'all. Thank you. Does anybody want to kind of want to share what you would do?
Good morning, Gail. This is Kimberly. I was in group 5, and we were in the midst of a discussion when we were pulled back into the room, so we didn't finish completely.
Sorry.
But we had 2 different spectrums. Initially, 2 of us thought that when we saw this happen, we would not automatically think learning disability. We would think they were rushed and they just didn't take their time for attention to detail. The struggle for us, or what we were actually trying to work through in our minds, is when you reach out and the student does not respond, then what? And then one of my colleagues shared a tip that she was putting in, and then I didn't actually fully hear it. So if she's back with us, I don't know if that piece of advice for what she would include in the syllabus would be helpful for others as well as myself.
Right, right. And it is awkward. It is an awkward thing to discuss. I agree with you that, if you reach out, what do you do? Because you guys are also, right now you're teaching virtually. I'm used to teaching in front of a classroom, so I'm used to just saying, asking the student, asking someone to see me for a minute after class, or emailing and saying, could you stay after class or something? But if they don't respond, what can you do? But typically kids want to do well. And so if they feel like, oh, I can get a better grade, another opportunity to take the test or whatever, usually they're going to respond. Yes, Adriana, let's see, thought that it was important to reach out to the student. Yes. But yeah, it's not going to be up to you to figure it out. I think that's where the conversation comes from. You're right. Students sometimes they're not good spellers, and they don't have good time management. They haven't learned that for whatever reason. All right, I'm going to press on. I wonder if there are privacy concerns with the tech Google. There shouldn't be. There should not be but at the same time, it's something you could certainly ask someone at IT about that. You absolutely. I know we use it for a lot of things, and we've done research on that because we worry about confidentiality. And yes, we talked about the challenges of catching these students in large lecture environment. I agree. It's hard to have private conversations. All right, I'm going to move on to math calculation, because now math is a lesser known disability area. Conversation with the student, we need to have conversations with the students. I agree. And see if they need accommodations, and if they, again, going back to that, helping them to get accommodations, helping them to know about things they may not know about. All right, so for math calculation, one of the big ones with math calculations, you can spot it because they can't estimate. They can't look at something and estimate how many it is. Even if they don't do well with symbolic number skills, which is like the digits, but they also don't do well with just dots. They don't seem to have what's called number sense. And they haven't learned it to automaticity. A lot of times what you can do with that is use a calculator. With math problem solving, if they have weak basic math skills, then math problem solving can also be a challenge. They can have weak fluid reasoning, which is nonverbal reasoning, processing speed, which I talked about earlier, working memory, and following and organizing multi-step problems. Okay, so accommodations for math disabilities, use of a calculator, extended time. Sometimes they need a model. And then be very careful that your questions don't have an unexpected math component. So for example, I've got this, knowing the expected percentage of students with learning disabilities in a classroom. How many students with learning disabilities would we expect to find in our class of 75? Okay, that's got math in it. You want to really, what you're trying to assess is the expected percentage of learning disabilities, but that's not what you're getting. For written expression, that can be spelling, but it can also be handwriting. The other thing is that one typically co-occurs with other areas. So they can have trouble organizing their thoughts, constructing sentences, and this also can depend on how much working memory they have. Some accommodations for written expression are extended time. Poor Speller's Dictionary. A Poor Speller's Dictionary is the old school dictionary, but you can look up words that don't need to be spelled right to look them up. Because, you know, we always used to tell kids, look it up. How do you look it up if you can't spell it? A Poor Speller's Dictionary, that's the old school way for paper and pencil. Nowadays, of course, you get the red squiggly line and you know it's wrong, and Word gives you recommendations. Speech to text software rubrics are really helpful to students with these disabilities because it really lets them know exactly what they should be working on and focusing on. And then giving multiple deadlines. Oral expression, students can struggle to explain something orally, but type out and say what they need to write beautifully. They can struggle to conform ideas or sentences, and sometimes it's hard to catch until kids are older because they need to then start creating organized paragraphs. All right, so somebody said, I remember reading that about 20% of students have a learning disability. Is that accurate? It's 33% of students in special education. I don't know that I would, now it might be, I've read that 20% of students have dyslexia, and I'm not sure that's accurate. But if you think about the number of students who have all of these disabilities combined, I don't know that it's 20%. Typically it's about 10% in a student, and I mean in special education in a district, might be a little bit higher. But again, that's going to encompass everything. So in our district, I think it's 12%, but that encompasses all of the areas of disability, all 13 IDEA areas. Oral expression, for some students who have trouble forming the words and getting the words out, this also overlaps with speech language impairment. It can look like anxiety, and it can cause anxiety for the child. And also, if any of you have ever struggled to find a word, for some kids, that's their life. They just struggle to find the word. Okay, so you're teaching online classes. Can we assume they all can use software from MS Word to paid version of Grammarly, so when they do assignments, they can avoid mistakes and typos? I don't think you could. I would never assume. I would ask. I would always ask. And you might even take the time, if you require written, a lot of written assignments, you may even take the time to give them, or not take the time because it's online, to make sure that they have access to some videos on how to use these things. So, and if they have questions, they can contact you. I would not assume that the students know how to use things. Not every kid comes to college with the same technology skills you think they would because it's so natural, but not every student has access to every single program. And they may have used something else in school. So Lee teaches mostly writing classes, and their assignments are full of spelling mechanics. Oh yeah, I will agree with you. I will absolutely agree with you. I will tell you, I had this conversation with Xavier when we first met, that for a long time, K through 12 did not teach spelling. There was a period of time where we taught whole language, and so we didn't teach spelling. And we've just come full circle and said, oh yeah, we probably need to be doing that. But for a long time, kids weren't taught spelling, which is why we have so many poor spellers. But they're luckily they are back to it. That's good. Mentioning it in your syllabus, telling them constantly. That's wonderful. All right, let me get on through this. All right, accommodations for oral expression. When spoken responses are required, questions should be provided in advance so they can, this would be more probably for things like foreign language, but giving them those questions in advance is really helpful. Text-to-speech software when needed, and then allowing extra time for oral responses. You know, we are quick to ask a question and want to get an answer, but a lot of kids don't process at the same rate. And so kids need sometimes kids need a little time to process. I call them kids, I'm sorry. Sometimes they need more time to process. Listening comprehension. This is a tough one. It can look like ADHD, but students can't really necessarily understand everything that's being said to them, especially if someone speaks quickly like I do. So what they need then is they may need additional explanations of what's been said, and they may be better at reading what's been said. So they may do better if they have closed captioning on slides or something like that. Hopefully they will know that. But if you're teaching content and it's complicated content, sometimes they may need to record the lesson as well. And I'm moving on to the interventions. But there's things that they can do. But again, it's going to be, they need to understand it, but you may need to help them. If they say, I'm really having trouble following on in lectures, what are some things that you need to do? Thank you, Lee. I appreciate, and I really appreciate your input about Google. That was wonderful. Thank you about a Google questionnaire. Okay, the next thing is for accommodations for listening comp. I just said speech to text, information provided in written form, re-saying things in multiple ways. If you say things in one way, rephrase it, say it again. And then checking, stopping, slowing down and saying, all right, is everybody with me? Anybody have any questions, that kind of thing? So what can you do? Make sure you have a disability paragraph in your syllabus. Reminders if you get a letter on a student and they don't identify. That's happened to me so many times. If a student fails an exam, ask why. I know that's hard because lots of students fail exams, but really ask why. Check with the student. That also, just in general, lets any student know that you want them to be successful. Reflect openness to helping. And then it's good to know the contact information for the disability office and be able to share that to students, just the phone number really quickly. All right, so I want to just talk a little bit about to understand the difference between target skills and access skills. Target skills. Target skills are what you want to assess. I want to know, do you understand the concept of operant conditioning? Do you understand the concept, and are you able to explain that to me? That's my target skill. An access skill is what the child needs to be able to do in order to give that to me, give that information to me. So In a student, the target skill may be ability to identify the abbreviations for all of the elements in the periodic table. So knowledge of different terms for psychological processes. Student may need general reading skills and memorization skills. So knowing that that child might need a whole lot more time to memorize that information or to actually learn it to automaticity. This is the one I talk about, providing answers on a Scantron. Students need to have good motor skills, and they need to be able to scan and align a visual field. If they can't do that, can't do it. So 5 years ago, I stopped. I said, no more, we're not using Scantrons anymore. And then writing a paragraph to compare and contrast. So they need to be able to compose a sentence. They need to be able to read and comprehend. They need to be able to organize their thoughts in writing. So if you've got a student that you know has a writing disability, this might be time to remind them of the supports offered in the district, sorry y'all, at the university in terms of I can't remember what it's called. There's a place where you can go to get assistance in writing with writing things. I can't remember what it's called, but I can remember referring students to that and having it in my syllabus. And talking with them. Writing Center, which is so basic, thank you, Xavery. Student Success Center, referring students to those places for help, asking them, or being willing to take the first draft and help them with that first draft if they really struggle, making some suggestions. The very last thing, if you guys would just be willing to share with me some things that you can do differently in teaching your class this semester. I love, I think it was Lee's idea of the questionnaire. I love that one. Offering alternative formats, that's great. Things I think my favorite really, Lee's, and I couldn't have suggested that. That was not my idea. Anybody else have anything that they would do differently in teaching? Making sure all of my videos are subtitled, excellent. That's perfect. Being aware of disabilities is helpful. Hopefully you can use this slide as a resource. Yeah, it's an invisible, like I said, these are invisible disabilities. Normalize the topic. Eve, oh, I love that one, Carly. Thank you. Normalize the topic. Yes, yes, perfect. Microsoft Teams will automatically subtitle for, that's very cool to know. I didn't know that either. I imagine that IT can help folks with a lot of things. YouTube as well, yes, it will close caption. Very good. You guys are rocking this. There's the Writing Center. Xavier, I'm so glad you're here. I continue to say that. That's wonderful because they can support students. And I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do a lot. All right, my very last slide is just, if you have questions, follow-up things, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer questions. If you get into a situation with a particular kid that you're trying to help and you're not sure how to do it, I know that the Disability Resource Office is there for you as well, but I'm certainly happy to help in any way that I can. Or if you need more explanation on any of these disabilities, I am happy to help as well. Feel free to email me anytime.